Ralph Ellis, welcome back to the program.
Good to be back with you again, Russell. It's always nice to talk to you.
Today we're talking about the true history of Cleopatra. We all know the story. Cleopatra, the last of the pharaohs, Julius Caesar, Mark Antony, suicide. Where does the story change for you, Ralph?
Yes, she was. So she was the last Egyptian pharaoh. She ruled with her brothers temporarily. She was married to her brothers, of course, as all of these dynasties did. They always married their siblings or daughters. And yes, she was the last of the pharaohs because Egypt was a very powerful nation, but it was never really a very militaristic nation. So it was always open to being taken over by more aggressive neighbors, and it had been taken over. It had had problems with the Hittites. It had been taken over by the Persians, circa 6th century BC. And the rising star, it had been taken over, of course, by the Greeks, because Cleopatra was half Greek. So it was taken over by the Greeks during the campaigns of Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great became a pharaoh of Egypt, so he was one of the last pharaohs. And his dynasty then combined with the Egyptian pharaonic dynasty to make this Greco-Egyptian dynasty, which was the Ptolemaic dynasty. So it's half Greek and half Egyptian. And Cleopatra was the last of this Ptolemaic line. Because, again, Egypt was getting a little bit weak. Previous Ptolemies had bankrupted the nation. There was infighting within the royal family. And one of the royal family had gone to Rome and said, look, because Rome was the rising star, of course, militarily, and said to Rome, look, can you arbitrate if there is any dispute between the children of one of the last of the Ptolemies. And of course there was a dispute between Cleopatra and her brothers, and so Rome used that as a pretext to come in and take over Egypt, because Egypt really didn't have an army at that time, and Rome did. But what Rome wanted is Rome wanted the Egyptian grain. So it was actually a good trade in some senses. As long as Egypt gave grain to Rome, Rome would offer protection. And so it worked both ways. It was actually quite a good union, because Rome didn't really want to take over Egypt. I mean, they didn't take over the population and repopulate it with Romans. They just wanted this grain supplies from Egypt to add to the wealth of the Roman Empire, which was growing at that time. And so that's what they did. And so that is why Cleopatra ended up marrying Julius Caesar. And so we have the very famous union between Cleopatra and Caesar as a united Romo-Egyptian monarchy, as it were. And that caused problems because that's not what Rome wanted, or rather, that's not what the patricians in Rome wanted. Because remember, Rome had been a republic up until the time of Julius Caesar. And they were still not very comfortable with having an emperor as opposed to the republic. And they were even less happy with having a king rather than an emperor, and rather than the sort of, as it were, elected republic. And so there were a lot of people who were very concerned about what direction that Rome and the new empire was going. And it was for that reason that Julius Caesar was murdered on the Ides of March. That was in 44 BC. And that's where it begins to tie into my Jesus type story, because I'd written about this, the Jesus story, way back in 1997 it was, and I'd outlined the fact that Jesus was a king in Judea, and I had tied him into the historical record as well as I could, but there were big gaps missing, and this is the new research that began to fill in some of those gaps. And because the Jesus history has a problem, a very fundamental problem. Because according to the Gospels, Jesus was a king. But if we follow the Gospel story, we for some reason, we have a king that was half Egyptian and half Persian. Because remember, he went to Egypt for his education, and yet the people who visited him when he was born were the Persian Magi. So he was connected to Egypt and connected to Parthia. But for some reason, this royal family, because Jesus was a king, was in a state of poverty in a stable, not in a palace. And then we ended up with this king who was powerful enough to have influence within Judea, but obscure enough to be lost to history. So what sort of monarchy was this? And you know, for many, many years, I was searching around looking for what sort of monarchy would fit all of those criteria. What monarchy in this region has been lost from history, and we don't know anything about it.
Shakespeare's play, right? Antony and Cleopatra. Where did they get the information for that one? And why were they so misinformed?
Well, no, I don't think they were misinformed. That's all correct. Because after Caesar, she went on to marry Antony and have three more children she had. So all of that history is correct, and that comes from the Roman record. It comes from even from Josephus Flavius, who writes about it as well.
Oh, because we know Josephus is so credible.
Yeah, well, yes, but I mean, he is. What Josephus says accords with history as we know it, except, of course, he has a big Roman bias. But then if you're reading the Roman historians and chroniclers, they have a big Roman bias as well. So, you know, if Rome has a big battle with Parthia, with Persia, they're not necessarily going to tell you the full details of how they lost the war with Persia. Everybody has a bias, and Josephus has his. But that part of the Cleopatra history is correct. So she went on from her marriage, which we're going to talk about again in a minute, with Caesar, and then she went on to marry Antony, Mark Antony, and that's when Rome was split into the I forget what they call it now. They ended up with two emperors. They had Augustus and Mark Antony, with Antony in the east, and he was based mainly in Egypt and governing the eastern borders of the Roman Empire. And of course, as far as we know, Cleopatra and Mark Antony were governing the eastern borders of the empire. And as far as we know, they did both die circa 33 BC or whatever it was, 30 BC, when Rome invaded again and Antony was defeated under Octavian, who actually invaded and defeated them both. So that part of her story is probably correct, that she died in Egypt about 30 odd BC. So how does that help us with the Jesus story? Well, for a long, long time, it didn't, of course, because it didn't seem to have any connection whatsoever with what I was looking for. I was looking, as I said before, for this Egypto-Persian prince or king who was somehow lost in Judea or Syria somewhere. And that eluded me for a long, long time. The way I found it was quite serendipitous, I suppose you might call it, because I was reading a newspaper and it had a list of the world's 100 worst books ever written. And I was scanning down this list, and one of them was the history of Queen Cleopatra and Jesus. I forget what the title was now. Jesus, the son of Cleopatra or something. I don't know what it was. Written by Mr. A.J. Bethel back in the early 20th century, late 19th century. So we're talking one of these Victorian again, one of these Victorian authors again, and historians. And as I've said many times before, these Victorian historians were very, very knowledgeable. They are much, much better than any of the modern historians we get who do broad brush investigations into history and don't seem to know very much at all. But anyway, this guy wrote this manuscript, and it wasn't even a book, it was only a manuscript, and it was deposited at the British Library. And it said that Jesus was a son of Queen Cleopatra. And, well, I mean, that's going to be rubbish. So in some senses, I agreed with the opinion that it was one of the world's worst books. But it had obviously information that might be useful. And a lot of these mad books do point you sometimes into the right direction because they contain information that you don't necessarily know about. So there was no such book. I discovered that. So I had to go down to the British Library and go and read it. And it was a manuscript. It was a deposited manuscript that had been sitting in the British Library for nigh on 100 years. And nobody had ever read it. I mean, you looked at the reader's card on it, and it hadn't been read in 50 years, sort of thing. So I started running through it, and it was quite a revelation because it gave me information that I didn't even know about and is not included in modern history that I had read. And I'm fairly well read on Near Eastern history, of course, writing all of these books. And I'd never heard of this before. And it contained not only the history of Queen Cleopatra, it contained the history of Queen Thea Musa Orania, who I'd never ever heard of. And probably a lot of listeners haven't heard of her either, who was the Queen of Persia, but may have been a queen or descended from a queen of Egypt. So that obviously piqued my interest. So I got a copy of this manuscript and took it back home and studied it. And it was a part of lost history. And so we ended up with this new story that I had not heard about before of Queen Thea Musa Orania. So perhaps we ought to talk about how she came along, because my take on this was quite different to the author who wrote this manuscript, Mr. Bethel, because he said that Queen Thea Musa Orania was Cleopatra, that she had escaped from Egypt in 30 BC, and she had run off to Persia, and she'd become the Queen of Persia. Well, that didn't strike me as being possible in genealogical terms. She would have been far too old to become a queen of Persia and have children in Persia after leaving in Egypt. I mean, it's stretching credibility quite a lot. So I went back and looked at the history of Cleopatra, and it seems that Cleopatra had another child with Julius Caesar. So they had a child. We all know they had Caesarion, who was born probably in about, don't quote me on this, but about 50 BC or 48 BC. So he would have been 4 years old, roughly, when Caesar was murdered. But the Roman historians, and this comes from Cicero, I think it is, Cicero, who says, he's talking about Cleopatra here, and he says, I am grieved to hear of Tertia's loss of an expected child. So Tertia had obviously had a miscarriage. But I should be glad of such a loss in the case of Queen Cleopatra and that expected heir of the breed of Caesar. This is in 44 BC, just as Caesar was murdered. Now that's interesting because Cicero is saying that Cleopatra was pregnant when Caesar was murdered. But what happened to that child? Cicero goes on to say that the crisis has passed and there was no heir. So what happened to that child? We don't know. There is no information. And it's likely, I think, that the child turned out to be a girl. Because Cicero was worried because what he didn't want is a scion or an heir of Caesar who was an Egyptian. He didn't want an Egyptian king ruling Rome. And that's what this child could have done. It could have grown up to have been a new emperor, but an Egyptian emperor through Cleopatra. But then Cicero is happy because the crisis passed. Why did the crisis pass? Well, you've only got two choices. Either Cleopatra had a miscarriage as well, which is possible, but nobody mentions it, or the child was a girl. And a woman could not become the emperor of Rome. It just was forbidden. And so I think this extra child, the unknown child of Cleopatra, was a girl. And that's why Cicero was happy. She could not become the emperor, and that's why she disappeared from history, because Cleopatra didn't want to know about her because she was a real disappointment. What she wanted was a son. She couldn't offer Caesarion as the next emperor of Rome because Caesar deliberately, for whatever reason we don't know, but deliberately failed to make him his heir. So he never actually acknowledged him as his child. So we don't know why that was. I liked the take on this on the BBC series. They did a series with HBO in Canada. That's the television company there, isn't it? And very good series called Rome. And they had this problem as well. So within the script in this TV series, they made Caesarion the son of a Roman, not even a centurion, just a Roman legionnaire. And so this was the big hidden history that Caesarion wasn't Caesar's. But this extra girl, this extra daughter, was born conceived while Cleopatra was living with Julius Caesar in the confines of his house in Rome. So there was fairly no doubt about her paternity. But she disappears from history. No one talks about her. So now what we've got to do is try and find what happened to this daughter. And the clue comes about 20 years later or so, when Octavian now is the emperor of Rome. So Mark Antony is defeated, and Octavian, Augustus, becomes the sole emperor of Rome. And he wants to sort out his borders because he has problems. There's been so much infighting within the Roman Empire that they now have to look outside and stabilize the borders of Rome. And so he went first to Mauritania, which is North Africa, basically. And he gave Juba II, or Yuba II, who was the king of Mauritania and a client king of Rome, of course, he gave him the daughter of Queen Cleopatra, who was called Cleopatra Selene. This is the daughter that was born through Mark Antony, of course. So Yuba II gets a daughter of Queen Cleopatra, who was known as Isis. She was an incarnation of Isis, so she was a goddess as well. And this minor king gets this goddess called Cleopatra Selene. And then Octavian disappears off to his eastern borders, to Persia, to Parthia, to meet with the big king there, who's Phraates IV. And remember, Parthia here is the big enemy of Rome. Rome had already lost 2 major wars with Persia back in the 1st century BC, and lost about, they lost about 6 legions or something. The invincible Rome was defeated on 2 occasions and lost the standards as well. They had lost the legion's standards to the Parthians. So this really was the feared enemy. And so Augustus really has to do something really, really good to placate Phraates IV. And so what does he do? He gives Phraates a concubine, a prostitute, called Thea Musa. And you've got to think to yourself, this doesn't ring true at all. You can't go to a king as powerful as Phraates IV and give him a prostitute and expect the king to be happy. I mean, if you did that, you would probably get an immediate declaration of war. But he didn't. Phraates IV was so pleased with his prostitute, he made her the primary queen of all of Persia. So what happened here? Who was this prostitute called Thea Musa, who eventually became called Queen Thea Musa Aurania? This is the forgotten queen we were talking about. It's pretty obvious from the research I looked into that this was the lost daughter of Cleopatra. That's why in Persia she's called Cleopatra Thea Musa. This was the lost daughter that nobody talks about. And so she was the daughter of Cleopatra and Julius Caesar. So she was quite a prize to the elderly king Phraates IV to have this young, what would she have been? She'd have been about, 20 years old, 25 years old. This young princess and goddess, effectively. Again, she would have been an incarnation of Isis. As his new queen. And so now we're beginning to start linking up with the biblical story, because now we have a princess of Egypt marrying a king of Persia. So we get the Egypt and Persia link. But what happens to this queen? So let's go down another 20 years, so we arrive at 2 BC, and Thea Musa Aurania is quite an ambitious little queen. So she exiles all the sons of her husband, the king, Phraates IV, and she exiles them all to Rome, apart from her son. Can he move, huh? So now the only prince of Persia, Parthia, who's left in Parthia, is her son, who is called Phraates, or Phraates V. And so he is going to become the next king of Persia. But the old king is not cooperating with this, and he won't die, so she poisons him. And so the king passes away, and her son becomes the next king of Persia. And just to seal this as a family dynasty, she then marries her son, which is interesting because this is in the Egyptian tradition, not in the Parthian tradition. So just as Cleopatra married her brothers, so now Queen Thea Musa Aurania is marrying her son, Phraates V. And they rule as mother and son, as king and queen. And she even gets coins minted for the first time, I think, ever in Persia, with the queen's profile on the coins. So they're dual. They have the king on one side and the queen on the back side. So Thea Musa Aurania has her own coins. And running back into Mauritania in North Africa, Cleopatra Selene did exactly the same thing. And again, it's unknown in that region. So Cleopatra Selene had her coins minted with her on one side and the king on the other side. And remember that these two queens, in my view, were actually half-sisters. They were both daughters of Cleopatra. And so I am linking this queen with Cleopatra, but now she becomes queen. We actually have a bust of her. And funnily enough, the bust of Queen Thea Musa Aurania of Persia looks exactly the same as the bust of Cleopatra that we have in the British Museum in London. And so there is quite an obvious family relationship between the two.
We did talk about this before the show, the bust of Cleopatra.
Yes.
She's not what I would consider a beautiful woman. She's in fact kind of homely, yet was able to seduce these great men.
Yes, she's a bit frumpy. If you want to know...
And as philosopher Blaise Pascal says, Cleopatra's nose, had it been shorter, the whole face of the world would have been changed.
Well, yes, quite. Yes, they've made a great thing of Cleopatra being the most beautiful woman in the world, but she wasn't. She was perhaps the most cunning, the most powerful, but she wasn't the most beautiful. If listeners want to know what she looks like and how she appears to me, and obviously to you as well, think of that TV comedy program from America about the scientists. What's it called? The something theory?
The Big Bang Theory?
The Big Bang Theory. Now, the frumpy one there, the girl that is the girlfriend of Sheldon, whatever she's called.
Mayim Bialik.
Yes. Now, you know what she looks like? That's Queen Cleopatra. That's what she looks like. That's what the bust looks like. She looks very much like that, a sort of very homely, not terribly Hollywood pretty sort of woman. But no doubt she had other talents. She was obviously very clever. She spoke 5 languages or something, and was obviously very astute politically with the various deals and links and marriages she made to make sure that Egypt survived within the Roman Empire as a powerful entity. And she achieved that. So she was obviously she was a very good politician and monarch. But pretty, no, not not by the coins. She's got this quite a large hooked nose, a very sort of Judaic Semitic nose. Yeah, it's interesting. But of course, Queen Thea Musa, if you look at her bust in Persia, she has the same features. They look very, very, very similar. And of course, these two busts were discovered, obviously, thousands of kilometers apart in different eras, and they've raised them up and found that they are almost identical. So that's one of the reasons why I think that Queen Thea Musa Aurania was the lost daughter of Queen Cleopatra. Yeah, it's interesting. So we're getting closer to this Jesus story, the biblical story. So how do we get this biblical story that happens over in Judea? We're not talking about Parthia here, we're talking about Judea. Well, as it happens, the Parthians got a bit upset with this queen. A, she had just poisoned her husband, which probably didn't help. And B, she had married her son, which also didn't help, because it really wasn't a Persian sort of tradition. This was an Egyptian tradition. And so she got kicked out. And so she got kicked out of Persia in AD 4. So we're talking about the right era here. Remember, within the Gospels, we have two dates for Jesus. We either have the Herod business, which gives us a date of about 6 BC, or we have the taxation under Quirinus, which gives us a pretty solid date of 6 AD. And I think the 6 AD date is the correct date, because what they've done is they've got the wrong Herod again, quite often within the biblical text, and even within the text of Josephus Flavius as well. They often get the wrong Herod, because they were all called Herod. And I think the Herod they're talking about, the Herod that was killing all the firstborn of the Israelites and all that business, was actually Herod Archelaus, who was the son of Herod the Great. And that would equate well with the 6 AD date. So I think we can sort of settle for the time being the date of this famous birth as being 6 AD. And this royal family were kicked out of Parthia in AD 4. Pretty much the same sort of time. And where did they go to? Well, firstly, this wasn't a royal family just being kicked out. They had the time and the power to arrange an orderly withdrawal, you might call it, because they left Persia with 600 cavalry and 200 courtiers. And what I didn't realize when I first looked at this within the first book in this series, so this comes from the book Cleopatra to Christ, which is the first book in the King Jesus trilogy. What I didn't realize at that time is I thought they'd come out of Persia and they had been more or less kicked out and were heading off towards the west in a poverty-stricken state, because they'd been kicked out of the country. And this is why we have the story, the biblical story, about them being in poverty, being with a son being born in a stable. Where did they go to? Well, the Roman historians give us a history of this, because they actually give us a history of this same queen being kicked out of Parthia, Persia. And they say that she went to Syria. And then we have an equivalent story from Josephus Flavius, who says that these Babylonian Jews from beyond the Euphrates again went into Syria. And so now we have almost the complete biblical nativity story. So again, what was the nativity story? It was a king, because Jesus is called a king on 36 occasions in the New Testament, who had come from the east because he was visited by the Persian Magi. Why would they be visiting if he had no Persian blood? Who was Egyptian because he went to Egypt for his education. Out of Egypt I have called my son, as it says in the New Testament. Who was in a state of poverty, in a stable, somewhere in Judea, Syria somewhere. And this was a king who had great influence, because remember, he was connected to Rome through Julius Caesar. He was connected to Egypt through Cleopatra, and he was connected to Persia via Phraates IV. This was the most well-connected prince in the whole of the known world. So yeah, this was a prince and a king with great influence. but he is also a prince and a king who is pretty obscure. Who has ever heard of him? Who has ever heard of Queen Thea Musa Orania of Persia? They've been scrubbed from history. Nobody knows about them. And so, yes, this is a monarchy, a king, who could be lost to history, so nobody knows about them. And so we have now the complete nativity story. We have the biblical family. This is where they were descended from. And all of the other information I've dragged up since that time has simply confirmed what I had thought all the way back. When did I write Cleopatra to Christ? Probably in about 2008, I think, something like that, circa that sort of era I wrote it. And everything I've discovered since that time has backed up this story and filled in all the blanks that I could not fill in at that time with that particular book.
Did you have errors in the book or just omissions?
I think just omissions. There's nothing has actually changed within the story, and that's pretty much true of all my books, actually. You know, when I said that Saul is Josephus way back in 97, everything I have found since then has built upon that story. And even Atwill and all of his business has built upon that story. You know, he joined me much later in 2006, I think he wrote his first book, Caesar's Messiah, when he started introducing some of this material. All of that material came from my book, Jesus, Last of the Pharaohs, which was written back in 97. And so all of these new books have built upon that material, and they have not really discovered any errors within the previous books. It's all building.
And of course, you've built upon the research of Nigel Appleby.
Yeah, and him as well. The man that did no research ever. But he did actually. He was very good at plagiarizing. But there we go. Yeah. So that was the book Cleopatra to Christ, and it was quite groundbreaking because it discovered a good candidate for this lost king that was the biblical nativity story, which I'd been hunting for prior to that for about 10 years and not found it, and only found it because of this strange manuscript that was deposited in the British Library 100 years ago by Mr. Bethel. So thank you very much, Mr. Bethel. You got the history wrong, but you had so much good information in your book that you facilitated that first book of mine on this subject, so within the King Jesus trilogy. So it was quite fortuitous that I actually read that, because how would you ever find it? There was only one manuscript in the whole world. It had never been printed as a book. So there was only one manuscript ever printed, and that was sitting in the British Library. So unless you're down at the British Library, you would never.
But how do you legitimize it then?
If it's been stored in the British Library, then it is a registered manuscript, and the British Library keeps all of their manuscripts forever. So all I had to do then is try and prove the various aspects that Bethel was talking about, whether they were true or not. And he was actually a very well-read. He was a bit like me, I think, this Bethel guy. He wasn't a well-known historian. He was a private historian. And, of course, within the Victorian era, they had a lot of these privateers. You know, they had privateer naturalists who did a lot of the discoveries in the natural world. They had privateer scientists who were starting the process of building a scientific establishment, and they had privateer historians as well. Just like all of the archaeologists running around Egypt were again privateers, a lot of them, and they were starting the process of generating a a sort of historical fraternity, but they were at that time they were very much doing it on a private basis, and this was just one of these wealthy guys who was interested in history, and he was obviously very well read as well.
Isis used that's goddess of wisdom, right?
Yes, goddess of wisdom. She was more the queen of the stars, I suppose. She was the wife of Osiris.
Of Osiris.
Yes, she was
Isis.
Isis was the wife of Osiris, and her son was Horus. So we have the Trinity, and this again ties in with a biblical story, because we then have the Trinity of Osiris, Isis, and their son Horus. And that's just been transferred in biblical terms into the god, and then the Madonna and Child. And within the Trinity, we have the God, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And the Holy Spirit is the what do they call it? She's the Holy Wind. If you translate it, it's not really spirit. We tend to think spirit in terms of a ghost or something like that, but it was actually more of a holy wind. The pneumos, I think they call it in the Greek, the wind. And so she's the equivalent of the, within the Quran, they have the jinn. And the jinn is again is a holy wind, as it were. It's a whirlwind in the Quran, and so she was the holy wind. And you think, well, what does that mean? Well, it goes back into Egypt again, because it's an incarnation of Nefertiti. Because Nefertiti was known as the Nefer, which is the holy wind. She was the Nefer. In fact, she was the Neferu, the many holy winds. So she had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. She had 5 Neferglyphs. So she was the 5 holy winds. And this might actually have something to do with the what they said about Mary Magdalene. She had the 7 devils that were chased from her. Well, the devils, again, are these holy winds. The devil comes in the form of a wind. So Mary Magdalene had 7 winds, whereas Queen Nefertiti only had 5 winds. So I think they're copying each other, basically. It's all the Holy Spirit is to do with Nefertiti. And so, again, you can have the Trinity within the Amarna dynasty. So within the Amarna dynasty, you have God the Aten, then the son of the Aten, who was Akhenaten, the king, Pharaoh Akhenaten, and then the Holy Spirit is Nefertiti, because her name means, or it can mean, it's not always translated like this, but the Neferglyph actually means holy wind. So she is the Holy Spirit, the holy wind. And again, we have the Trinity. It all links back into Egypt, of course, and this is why the Egyptian ancestry of Jesus is so important, because he wasn't simply Persian, he was half Egyptian. And that's why he went into Egypt for his education, because he would have gone to Alexandria. And we've got a pretty good idea that he went to Alexandria, because within the apocryphal Gospels, John the Baptist taught in Alexandria, and his favorite and best student was Simon Magus, who again is another biblical character. He's mentioned, I think, once in Acts of the Apostles, but he is a big part of the Clementine Recognitions, which is one of these apocryphal Gospels. And he was taught, Simon Magus was taught by John the Baptist in Alexandria. And we also know that Alexandria is linked very strongly because Hero of Alexandria, who was the great scientist from Alexandria, he was like the Leonardo da Vinci of the 1st century AD, who made all of these wonderful mechanical machines. Like he made a jet engine, basically, an aerophile, I think they call it, which was a steam turbine sort of thing. And he made, mechanical birds that sang and all of this sort of business. But one of his favorite tricks, because he made a lot of tricks as well, it was part and parcel of the temple process, that the temple must have various amazing things, mechanical things, to amaze the public, including, you know, automatic doors and slot machines and all of this sort of business. But one of his favorite tricks was turning water into wine. And so Hero of Alexandria made 4, I think, different types of jugs, trick jugs, that turned water into wine. And of course, this was the turning of water into wine in the gospel story at the wedding of Cana, which was the wedding of Jesus and Mary Magdalene, by the way. So that's why it's mentioned in the Gospels, because that was Jesus' own wedding. And he had a trick jug that was made by Hero of Alexandria. So this wasn't a miracle. All of this is quite readily explainable. And we have not only the original drawings of this trick jug, it's actually quite clever. It's worked on siphonic action and water tension. So you've got to be quite a fairly good scientist in order to work out how you can actually make this thing work. And it just has a little air hole in the handle, and depending on whether you cover up the air hole or let it go, depends on whether you get water or wine out of it. So it's quite nice. It's quite interesting piece of engineering. But as Hero says, how does he put it? It's something like, so we can deliver wine to one person and water to another person who we wish to make a joke with. And that's pretty much how he phrases it. So it was a joke. It was a jest, and this has been passed down in Christian history as being a miracle. Nothing to do with historical miracles at all. This was science. This was Gnosticism. This was from the Gnostics. The Gnostics, if you translate Gnosticism into Latin, it becomes scientia. And if you translate scientia into English, it becomes science. So the early Gnostics were the early scientists, and this is exactly what Hero of Alexandria was doing. And he came from Alexandria, and Jesus was using this trick jug from the great scientist of Alexandria. So it's quite clear he had a connection with Alexandria here. And it's also quite clear that if he could afford to own one of these trick jugs, I mean, these weren't made for the lay people. These were made for the aristocracy, for the monarchs, and for the very wealthy temples. That Jesus must have been a very wealthy monarch himself to have afforded one of these trick jugs. So, yeah, we get all of those side connections as well with this story going back into Egypt with Queen Cleopatra.
Someone asks here, why did Cleopatra decide to commit suicide?
I think she had run out of options. She had backed the wrong horse, basically. It's always difficult when you make the wrong decision, isn't it? She had decided that Antony was the powerful one. Because remember, Mark Antony was the great army commander of Rome. And he was battling initially in an alliance with, but then ended up battling with a young boy called Octavian Augustus. It was pretty obvious who was going to win. It was going to be Mark Antony. Couldn't be any other way. There was no way he could fail. And so she backed Mark Antony as being the next, as it were, emperor of Rome. And, of course, she backed the wrong one because Antony eventually lost. Octavian pulled off the impossible and defeated the army of... I think on the first occasion, at the first battle, Octavian lost the first battle, I think. But then he came back, as it were, from the dead, and he defeated Antony, which nobody expected whatsoever. And so what to do after that? She had backed everything on Antony winning and becoming the next emperor of Rome, and he lost. So she had lost everything. And there's no way that Octavian would have allowed her to retain any dignity after that. He was quite a ruthless guy. I suppose you've got to be. If you're going to be emperor of Rome, you've got to have a ruthless streak in you. And he certainly did. And again, that was portrayed quite well in the BBC HBO series called Rome, where he was very much a scheming youngster who was only ever thinking about the next chess move to make in his bid to become the sole emperor of Rome. And I think that's exactly how he was in real life too. So what else could she do? She was stuck. It was either take your own life or be taken to Rome and paraded through the streets of Rome in golden chains, as were her children. Her children were taken through Rome, chained together with golden chains. It was said that the chains were so heavy that the children could hardly carry them as they were paraded through the streets of Rome. And she didn't want that, so, what else to do?
Nice artifacts to have, eh?
Yeah. I don't know if they would have been gilded. It seems extraordinarily extravagant to me to have golden chains chaining these children. So I don't know. It could well be that they were just gilded. They had the technique of gilding in those days.
One last audience question. Once again, Ralph Ellis, great guest on the show. Visit edfu-books.com. Audience asks, was Cleopatra pure Egyptian?
Well, no, because she was half Greek. However, there's always a however somewhere, isn't there? There's got to be a however.
Sure is with you.
Sure is with me. I have a slightly different take on the history of Egypt. So maybe she was more Egyptian than possibly we think. So she was a Greco-Egyptian princess through the Ptolemies, and Ptolemy was an army commander who had been working for Alexander the Great, and he ended up as being the king, as it were, of Egypt, the pharaoh of Egypt. However, going back 1,000 years before that, we have this story from Manetho, and also some from various other ancient chroniclers, including what Josephus Flavius says about it, of people from Egypt, pharaohs from Egypt, being exiled to Greece. We have this, and this comes into my story, the book Scota, the Egyptian Queen of the Scots, which we talked about before, about this Egyptian queen being exiled over to Ireland and Scotland. As a part of that story, it says that Egyptus, which is probably where we get the name for Egypt from, so there was a king called Egyptus, Pharaoh Egyptus, although he wasn't really Pharaoh because he was the brother of the Pharaoh, and the Pharaoh was away campaigning somewhere over in Syria or something, and he assumed the kingship when he shouldn't have done, and he was called Egyptus, but he got exiled to Greece. So we have this story within the Scotti Chronicon story as well, which is the story of the origins of the Scots, of a part of the Egyptian royalty being exiled to Greece. And even before that, when I wrote the story of the Exodus, which is in my book Tempest and Exodus, we had the story of the Exodus, which is the Israelite Exodus, but I said it was the same as the Egyptian Hyksos Exodus. So they were one and the same Exodus. It was the Hyksos Exodus, the Hyksos Israelite Exodus. And part of that Exodus went up to Judea as per the biblical story, but part of that Exodus appears to have gone across the Mediterranean again and gone over to to Crete, to Minos, the Minoan Empire. And so through these two links, we ended up with what I think was an Egyptian royalty over in Greece, the original sort of Mycenaean. And there was a nice actually little part of that where within one of my books, which one was it? I think it was within the Scota book, Scota, the Egyptian Queen of the Scots, where I was just tracing out the history of Crete and the Minoans and the history of their language, because they had this early script, which may have become Phoenician later on, which was called Linear A and Linear B. And they managed through an amateur, rather like myself, nobody knew how to translate this script. So Linear B was totally unknown. Nobody knew what it was, how to translate it, how to pronounce it. It was a totally unknown script. It's a bit like Egyptian. It's all done with glyphs. And this amateur called Ventus, I forget his first name now, but anyway, Ventus came along and said, it's Greek. And of course, all the Greek scholars were up in arms saying, what do you mean? This is our language. How dare you? It's got nothing to do with Greek. But, you know, after 10 years, he proved that he was correct. It was Greek. It was Mycenaean Greek. And as a part of looking into this little story, which was a fascinating little story, the history of Linear B, it had a list of Mycenaean words written in Linear B. And I should really go into this a little bit more. But anyway, on this page, they had 10, 15 words or something. And every single one of those words was Egyptian. So I think Mycenaean is Egyptian, just written with different glyphs. Really need to look at that a little bit more and maybe try and prove that case. But that would fit in very well with my story of these exiles from Egypt, because remember, Egypt was the big superpower at that time. And if you're going to have a civil war within Egypt, like the Hyksos Civil War, or like even the Amarna Civil War with Pharaoh Akhenaten, that some of those exiles might go across the Mediterranean to escape from losing that civil war. And I think this is what happened. Some of these exiles ended up in Crete with the Mycenaeans, with the Minoans, and some of them ended up in Greece with the Mycenaeans. And so when we end up with Mycenaean kings like Alexander the Great, and Alexander the Great was another ginger-haired person, suddenly we can start to see where this monarchy came from. Because remember, Ramesses II, when his body was taken, I think we discussed this before, his body was taken to Paris for preservation because it had started to decay a little bit. And so they did a study of, a forensic study of his mummy. And by taking subcutaneous hair samples, follicles from his head, they were able to determine that Ramesses II was ginger-haired. He was a pale-skinned, ginger-haired man. And so this, because if you look at his mummy now, he's got like blonde hair and so on, and they're all saying, you know, it's part of the preservation service. But this forensic study showed that it wasn't. He was actually true ginger-haired. And of course, Alexander the Great was ginger-haired as well, as was Jesus, of course. He was ginger-haired as well. And so it's likely that this Ptolemaic dynasty that came from that came from Greece and took over Egypt, could have been half Egyptian themselves through Alexander the Great and through the Mycenaeans. And so when we come through to Cleopatra, who was half Greek, half Egyptian, she actually might have been 80% Egyptian and only 20% Greek, as it were. So we have the continuing story of this very influential Egyptian dynasties who seem to have populated so many areas around the Mediterranean basin, including now, it seems, parts of Crete and Greece, and then following the Scotus story all the way through to Ireland and Scotland and maybe Scandinavia as well, all part of the same story and the same royal family. So, interesting story. It would be nice actually to tie it up one day with sort of DNA type evidence, but that lies in the future. So we'll see what happens on that. One other thing for readers, readers, I keep calling them readers. One other thing for listeners, of course, is that Edfu Books now has a new website.
Yeah, I was going to bring that up. It looks incredible.
Yeah, it's good, isn't it? It's quite nice. So after many years, because the previous one was done, I don't know, it was back in 2004 or something. It was cutting edge at the time, but it was getting a bit long in the tooth. So it's been updated. It actually has a new address, but the old address points back to it, so you can't miss it. And give it a visit. It's got some good information on there, and it looks nice now. And it's fully compatible with all of the tablets and everything else.
What's the new address, Ralph?
Well, the new address is the same with .uk instead of .com. But the .com will take you back through to it. So it's edfu-books.com or .uk.
Right on. Ralph Ellis, always a treat. The True History of Cleopatra with Ralph Ellis. Great show, man.
Thanks very much for having me on. Thank you.
Ralph Ellis, thanks so much for being on the program.
Thanks for having me on again, Russell. It's always a pleasure to be with you.
And Ralph, it's been great having you on the show. I'm just bugging you.